Okay. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Naomi Rankin. I'm the leader of the Communist Party in Alberta. And the session that we have planned today is to discuss the question of social services and social spending generally in Alberta, what the government policy is, what's wrong with it, what our party policy is. This is part of a discussion that's leading up to a sort of pre-election period so that these discussions will help us to refine and improve the platform that we put forward to the public during the election campaign. So we look forward to your comments and remarks on this. So I'm going to make a presentation. It won't be terribly long, and I hope that the bulk of the time we can have for discussion. First, I'd like to acknowledge that various people are attending here from different places around the province, which means that we are attending from the territory of several different treaties. It's the position of the Communist Party of Canada that we fully acknowledge the Indigenous rights, including the right of self-government of Indigenous nations, and that we support the struggles of Indigenous people for autonomy and controlling their own development within their own communities. We further acknowledge that the history of the negotiation of treaties has been one-sided. It has not been entered into in good faith on behalf of either the British imperial colonial government or the Canadian government in the 150 years since Confederation. And that we are committed to the support of Indigenous rights, Indigenous self-government, and the renegotiation on terms of equality amongst nations. So on to the actual topic at hand today. I don't want to talk in great detail about just what the provincial government has done, or how many millions of dollars they've cut from education, how many million from healthcare, how nefarious it is, and so on. I think probably people are generally aware of this situation. What I wanted to do is actually kind of take a step back and talk about the whole history of the strategy of capitalism with respect to the rights, benefits of the working class, and economic policy, really generally, to have a context, a historical context of why are they doing this, and why do they keep doing this? Why do they keep cutting spending and whittling away at social services? So it's kind of like a capsule history of the whole 20th century, really. I'd start with World War I, the end of World War I, and the Soviet Revolution. That a lot of the history of capitalism in the course of the whole 20th century has been in response to the Soviet Union, in response to the need to look better than socialism. So although there's also been a great deal of repression by capitalist governments over the course of the 20th century, this is one of the underlying themes, especially in the North America and the imperial center, the more developed capitalist countries, that there's been a need for the whole period from 1917 to 1992 to look better than socialism, to fend off the very powerful argument that socialism could provide a better life for working people. So it's given rise to the need to provide unemployment insurance, Medicare, subsidized education, some minimal social supports, such as welfare. In many countries, support for public housing. That's one area in which North America really lies behind compared to the European imperial powers. But that's not the only response that capitalism has had to the Soviet Revolution. There's also the response of naked aggression and attempts to destroy the socialist revolution. Immediately after that revolution, the various Western powers conspired to invade and attempt to overthrow the revolution. And it was a very difficult, close-fought battle for several years before the Soviets gained military control in their own territory. And even like on through the 20s, there's still this tension between the need to make some concessions to the working class, to fend off revolutionary impulses, and the desire to repress any kind of working class movement. So this became even more acute during the Great Depression, right? When obviously there's a great deal of misery, there's a great deal of dissatisfaction. That was the period of the development of Keynesianism as an economic theory, where the idea that government should deliberately spend more during downturns of the economy in order to stimulate demand, and that would help to prop up employment levels and smooth out the ups and downs of the business cycle. So Keynesianism was, in fact, more or less official policy of the state theory of economics for several decades. Immediately after the Second World War, once again, there were two different responses to the attractions of the Soviet Union, which, after all, up throughout the war were our brave Russian allies. The prestige of the Soviet Union in defeating Nazism was very high. So once again, there was a twofold response. One was a Cold War, a really severe, fierce propaganda campaign attempting to portray the Soviet Union as an aggressive danger to the world. But the second was the construction of the welfare state in the developed world. Once again, to provide enough mitigation of the effects of capitalist exploitation that workers would not be driven to consider a revolutionary alternative. But the post-war period also was a period of easy economic expansion for capitalism, because even because of the incredible destruction caused by the Second World War, there was really a need to rebuild. There were abundant places for capital to be invested. There were opportunities for capital. And this continued on really for a couple of decades until the obvious places for capital to go, the obvious investments were essentially saturated. But this was also the period of the decolonization and national liberation struggles around the world, and the civil rights movement in the US. So through the 60s, there was this expansion of social services, the expansion of the concept that people were entitled to some social safety net and some rights. But by the mid-70s, right, the decolonization had been essentially completed. The last outliers, like the Portuguese colonies gaining their independence, Mozambique in 1974, the Vietnamese military victory over the US invaders in 1975. So essentially, the decolonization was complete. But even from the earliest days after the Second World War, a neo-colonialist response was developing of ways to continue to exploit the former colonies without having direct state control. So the 50s and the 60s is also the era of CIA-sponsored coups and assassinations in countries attempting to assert their independence. This continues under different names and different government agencies in the US right up to the present day. Policies of regime change against any government who attempts to assert their independence from the international economic order that the US imperialism wishes to impose. So And there was also an economic response, an economic neo-colonial response, which you could see like in the International Monetary Fund and the coercion that they would impose on countries that needed loans, where a condition of money from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund was restructuring, was cutbacks on social spending, and which, no matter what the cost to that country, no matter how much that would set back their general economic development. And this policy as well has continued on through the present day, up through the modern free trade agreements that champion the interests of multinationals over and above any kind of independent national rights of the countries who participate. But by the mid-80s, that easy post-war expansion was over, and the limitations of Keynesianism were becoming more apparent. So at this point, you'd had the development of a new ideological mechanism to reverse course for a counteroffensive by capital, in the form of what we now call neoliberalism and a supply-side economics. Like Milton Friedman is one of the names associated with it. Is essentially a new supposed economic theory, which was a counteroffensive against social spending in support of cutbacks, deregulation, and tax cuts. So the 80s, this is the mid 80s, this is the period of the election of Reagan in the US and Thatcher in Britain, when they began a very vigorous policies of deregulation, allowing much more free rein to corporations, tax cuts, disproportionately tax cuts to corporations, but overall, reducing in the sources of government revenue, and correspondingly, the cuts to social services, health, and education that would be necessitated if you have less in the way of government revenue. And of course, in Alberta, this came to fruition with the election of Ralph Klein in 1992, which also, this coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the socialist countries of Europe. So this essentially opened up an era when they did not have to compete with the Soviets. They didn't have to prove themselves to be better than socialism. Like Thatcher openly saying, there is no alternative. So it came a little bit later in Alberta because our economy had been buffered by the enormous wealth of, coming from the energy sector, even with unnecessarily low tax rates and unnecessarily low royalties, which we talked about at our last meeting. There was still so much money floating around that the effect of cuts was not felt until 92, when Ralph Klein became premier in 93, when they began real wholesale cuts to health and education spending, and this has essentially continued ever since. With a very partial exception of the Ed Stelmach period. When Ed Stelmach was premier, he actually suggested that maybe they should have a look again at what would be appropriate royalty rates, and he was soon knifed in the back by his own party for this suggestion. So the Conservative Party, under whatever names, has all along been wedded to the corporate interest of the multinational corporations, predominantly those in the energy sector. And so over and over again, they've taken every opportunity to cut revenues by giving tax royalties holidays to those corporations, and thereby undermining government revenues, and relentlessly continuing to cut social services and whittle away at the standard of living that the baseline standard of living. In order to do this, though, they can't only make those economic cuts, they also have to attack labor rights and social rights generally, because people don't just passively accept these kinds of cuts. So this goes hand in hand with attempts to whittle away trade union rights. Under Kenney, they were particularly aggressive in this, in trying to essentially prevent labor unions from doing anything in response to any of these government campaigns. So I'd say that the election of Danielle Smith is essentially, it's simply a continuation of the same policy that every subsequent premier now for some period of time, and setting aside the interregnum of the NDP, every succeeding conservative premier has been more and more right-wing, more and more subservient to these corporate interests, and more and more willing to cut social spending. So like under the Kenney regime, they were whittling away. I mean, there were major cuts to public education at all levels, 500 million, major attacks on healthcare, attempts to destroy any kind of public housing or subsidized housing, like real serious privatization, cutting the cost of living index, like essentially effectively reducing AISH, assistance for individuals, because which supports the most vulnerable people at the lowest possible level of subsistence. So it's quite clear that there's really no limit to how low that they can go. The only limitation is how much will the working class organize itself to fight back? And so this is the open question, and this is the point at which we have to attempt to intervene, we as communists. How much what can we do to help promote a mass movement that will have a clear understanding of these kinds of cutbacks and will fight back against them and respond and have a positive program of its own, with a different way of approaching this. It's not inevitable that those particular corporations must have the upper hand in all matters. That's a political response, and there can be a different one. So the Alberta Federation of Labor, recently has had several campaigns, despite the fact that they're hampered by having to also fight just for the bare right to express any political opinions in the name of the labor movement. So, for example, last fall, they came out with a report that they called Industrial Blueprint for Job Creation and Prosperity. It pretty much parallels what has been called just transitions by some other movements, about the attempt to diversify the economy to provide employment in response to the dwindling employment in the energy sector. They had actually a quite clever publicity campaign for it, talking about skate to where the puck is going, like that is, plan for the future instead of simply responding passively to past economic realities. And also, more recently, the Federation of Labor has had several other sort of public pronouncements and campaigns. One about the cost of living, which is calling on Albertans to lobby their MLAs, like to tackle inflation, to tackle price gouging, including taxing excess profits that corporations have been able to take advantage of in this period of inflation. So that's actually, I think, a fairly strong set of demands, relatively strong set of demands that the AFL has been able to make. And they've also, they did some videos exposing the absurdity of far right sort of propaganda, the far right attitudes of Danielle Smith, particularly about the blaming Ottawa, like the attempt to foment regional bigotry. And the most recently, the AFL has come out with several pronouncements, like calling on Albertans to rally around to protect the Canada pension, like to attempt to foil the conservative attempt to provincialize the pension, to seize the Alberta section of the Canada pension, which we know would be a pretty bad idea, because we can be pretty sure that they would simply use that as a slush fund to continue to subsidize the energy sector, and then it would be all gone, along with our possibility of having the pensions that we in fact have been paying into. So, but I'd also like to just talk about what's the underlying cause of why this counteroffensive against social services and against social spending. Essentially, it's a counteroffensive against government revenues and government conducting the economy. And it's not just an abstract ideological objection to government being involved in the economy. There's real reasons why the corporate sector finds itself up against the reality under capitalism of a declining rate of profit. This is, going right back to the mid 1800s. Marx and Engels, studied this and talked about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Essentially, as all the most profitable areas of the economy are invested in, and those parts of the economy are saturated with capital, there are fewer and fewer opportunities for capital to make a profit. So in fact, the reality is that governments don't behave in a laissez-faire manner. None of them ever have, including the ones who most claim to be led by that kind of ideology. They, in fact, intervene as much as they can to provide opportunities for corporations to invest and to eliminate the risk to the corporations, to guarantee profits for investments that may or may not make economic sense from the point of view of producing value. They still, in fact, the governments, including the parties that most claim to believe in small government, they only believe in small government when it's a question of intervening on behalf of the working people to support their standard of living and their labor rights. They do not, in fact, engage in that same kind of small government behavior when it's a matter of subsidizing corporations, even the largest of them. So this neoliberalism, this policy and supply side economics, it is in fact not just an attack on the working class to maximize the profits of the corporations. It goes as far as it's an attack upon essentially every other sector other than the largest corporations. Like, it works against the petty bourgeoisie, the small producers, the small formerly independent producers. It works even against like national bourgeoisie, like people who are corporations, small corporations or companies that work to supply a local market, who would tend to be more involved in actual productive parts of the economy. So it's in fact a policy to support the largest corporations. And this is also a reason why you see it happening really on a global scale. It has its special features in Alberta, but it's a problem that we're having to grapple with really in every capitalist country in the world. So the question of what kind of a fight back there's going to be is, I'm afraid, still an open question. We would love to see a really mass, vigorous response on behalf of working people all over the province, rising up and indignantly repudiating what this government is trying to do. But in fact, I'm afraid we don't see that mass resistance and mass struggle against it still has to be built. So that's part of our job as communists. That's part of the process of building class consciousness, is to involve ourselves in the struggles that really do exist, that people must engage in right now, even if they don't have a long-term revolutionary point of view, they actually have to fight for their own well-being and their own livelihood right now in the face of insecurity, inflation, and so on. So I'll just mention this is not directly the topic at hand, but it is the case that our party, the Communist Party of Canada, is launching a campaign across the country to roll back prices, protect incomes, and to tax the corporations. So there'll be some more material coming out on that point soon, because that is a point of where we can engage with working people at all different levels of political development. That's something that we have to fight for right now. But what's different is the Communist Party is going to fight for that in the context of a larger strategy of building up a more united and class-conscious working class movement that could ultimately turn around and not just to be defensive, but to take the offensive, to begin to actually make some move towards nationalizing, taking control of the economy and building towards socialism. So I'm not going to say much more about that. As I say, I don't think I need to, talk a lot about the factual details of what's happening with social services. I'm sure everyone here has some experiences of their own that they can talk about this. So at this point, I'd like to just throw it open for a general discussion. So if you wish to either raise your hand, or if you can't do that, just speak up. Okay, I see MJ. I'm not sure who that is, but yes, go ahead.
Hi, Naomi. It's Morgan.
Oh, yes. How you doing?
Super good. I just finished reading Wage Labor Capital by Marx, and I'm also often working on foreign policy. So thinking a lot about the inflation crisis and the affordability crisis. The NDP, for example, is directing the unions, telling them, where to place the struggle and where political organizations and unions can work together. And of course, they're telling them to blame the petty bosses rather than looking at the international crisis, the war, and the monopoly category of corporate profits, super profits that have benefited and exploited the war in order to double the revenue. So for example, oil and gas, LNG interest, and future hydrogen interest, thrusting markets in Europe into monopolies. So I guess my question is, how do we frame the importance of fighting imperialism when there is a struggle right in front of us for working people, where we do still need to fight our bosses? That's important, but the NDP will not admit that they support the crisis in the way that it has directly resulted in the destruction of the consumer price index through sanctions, economic displacement, and war. And Canadian oil and gas interest is doubling, just as Exxon and Chevron in the United States. So obviously, they're covering their butts and they're protecting corporate interests by telling people to blame it on their petty bosses rather than the corporate monopoly bosses. So how do we balance the two?
Well, that's a very big question, isn't it? There's no easy answer to that. Right? I mean, what you've done there is you've reworded what is political strategy, right? What is our political strategy? So if anybody else has any good, clear, incisive answers to that, I'd be happy to hear it. But I think the situation is really even more complicated than what you've described, because I don't think that the unions are actually at the beck and call of the NDP. If anything, the problem is that the unions are starting to come even more, less under the guidance of the NDP, and they're starting to flirt with the liberals or even the conservatives in different parts of the country. That the but of course, we've never supported that the unions and the NDP should be like organically linked. Although that might just appear to be self-serving, that we would prefer unions to be linked to our party, but it's not that. We think that it's important that the unions should have their own independent vigor in the political arena. They should be putting forward their own point of view, and so yeah, it's a problem about how to get them to. I think, in fact, that, if you actually look at what the Alberta Federation of Labor has done, it isn't so really bad. We know that in effect, they want to get the NDP elected and not the Conservatives. And that we know that there'd be a real problem with them not directly confronting the NDP once the NDP does form the government again. But in fact, what they are saying now is, it's not what communists would say, but in fact, it's not that bad. They are actually addressing, quite a few of the main issues. They seem to have figured out a way of doing it, like navigating the difficulty of not seeming to simply criticize their own members for having been fooled by right-wing ideology in the past. So I think that essentially, like, the way forward is like we have to find ways of engaging in a really practical day-to-day way in those in those fight back activities, even the very modest ones, even the smallest opportunity to get people into action, criticizing the government or questioning government policies. We know that we're not in a mature revolutionary situation, so we have to recognize that we need to seize even the smallest, most modest opportunities to engage in that sort of ideological battle. I think. I see Jesse has their hand up.
Screen on. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just want to say thank you. It's a very good introduction to the party's platform. So I really appreciate that, Naomi. It's a good introduction to the platform and to the material history behind it. Like, we're not just talking about ideology here, we're talking about the material reality of the exploitation and the disempowerment of the working class. And the question that seems to be asked right now to me is, like, what can be done to help along a mass movement? And I think part of it personally is that no one talks about what this mass movement ought to look like. We talk about it as if it's going to be a mass movement against the government, but as you said, the government itself is at this point subservient. You might even say like a victim of large corporate interests. Attacking the government isn't going to be helpful so long as they're being so heavily funded by these corporate interests. So my take is and has been based on action that was taken by the Japanese Communist Party shortly after World War II. Has a history of successfully cooperating industry as a form of protest.
Sorry, can I just interrupt for a moment? I think Blythe, I think your mic's on. We're getting some noise. Can you mute?
Oh yeah, a little bit.
And I see Helen as well. Like, whoever is not muted, please mute themselves. Other than Jesse. Okay, carry on.
Mute.
Yeah, just talking about the cooperating industry. The Japanese Communist Party has a history of some very heavy success in cooperating industry as a form of protest and as like a form of seizing the means of production and direct action taken to empower workers and disempower capitalists. That is taking over industry and essentially kicking their bosses out, but continuing to work under a new cooperative being formed by that workplace. Until the police come. But like, it doesn't necessarily need a lot of people to get started. It just needs to happen in multiple places at once and just to get that ball rolling. And I think you were talking about clear-cut goals like elections where you can say cut and dry, we have done this. is that sort of cooperatization something that could be positioned as a potential goal in that matter? I know it's a large goal, but it's at least a direction that can be taken.
Well, it's what you've talked about. It's a very interesting thing. Like it's kind of a sort of a form of kind of direct action, like where people just immediately, as opposed to having a sit down strike, they lock out the bosses kind of. So, but again, it just all depends. There's all different kinds of strategies that can be used. And depending on the context, they could be a good idea or bad idea. Right? Some, like, even if we look at like nationalization, generally speaking, we advocate for nationalizing all the commanding heights of the economy, all the major corporations in corporate entities in all the major sectors, banks, mines, railroads, the energy sector, so on. But even nationalization can sometimes just be used as a tool of government to subsidize corporations. Like if they take over a failing company, and pay for it, essentially they're bailing out, they're subsidizing the owners, they're paying the owners of that corporation for their failure, and they're taking on the subsidizing the rest of the economy by keeping a non-profitable corporation going. So even nationalizing can be used against the working class. It can be used to continue to funnel more of the wealth of society into corporate profits. Sometimes some of those kinds of actions, like taking over a factory, can be, like a step forward for the working class. There's other times when they've been fooled into buying out the bosses of a failing company, so that the former owners are guaranteed their price, but then the workers are stuck with the debts and the company that's going to fail. That has happened in the past too. So there's been occasions, when our party has advised the workers that maybe it's not such a good idea to form a co-op and try to keep that plant going. It really depends on the context. So besides doing the economic analysis of what would work, what would actually be productive and contribute to the economy, there's also the complicated question of what would be useful as an experience for the workers to gain the experience of taking control and running things themselves, and what lessons they will draw from that. How will that help to contribute to the development of class consciousness and class unity? Again, really, a really complex question, no very simple answers for that. But obviously, there's really no strategy or activity that would be totally off the table. It always depends on the context about what would be helpful. So, Trace, go ahead. Well, it looks like Trace has actually disappeared.
No, I'm here.
Oh, you are there.
Took the
Okay.
hand down. I've got the mute. Yeah, no, I was just saying that the unions and cooperatives and all of that are all good ideas. I agree with that. But how do we get people even to the point where they're going to want to unionize workplaces that aren't, or if they are cooperatives, to move in? Well, if they're unionized, move into cooperatives rather. I mean, or any other direction if most workers don't even want to consider discussing unionizing their workplaces. I mean, I've been trying when I can to get a union going in my own workplace, and nobody wants to do it because they just see it as a temporary job, or the bosses are too nice, or they leave, or or they hear that someone's talking about unionizing. It wasn't me this last time. The rumors are starting to fly about, but all of a sudden they're talking, oh, someone's talking about unionizing. Oh, they're going to get canned and stuff like that. Because the last person who did speak up loudly about unionizing our place got fired, coincidentally. So yeah, how do we get people to that place in the first place?
Okay, everybody's asking the really big strategic questions here. Yeah, once again, yeah, that's a very, that's a very big question, a very difficult one. So there's really, essentially no techniques are off the table. So I think it really, that's a kind of question that has a lot of kind of local context. Like it might have to be a kind of workplace by workplace analysis of what's going to be the key issue or the turning point within this workplace. And I mean, what you've described, I mean, it happens over and over. It takes a great deal of patience and trying again. And more unionizing attempts fail than succeed, given it's not just the difficulty of convincing the workers, of raising class consciousness, but of course the rules for official unionization are stacked against the union in places like Alberta. So it's an intrinsically difficult process and would require long, slow, patient work. And as you've touched on, like so many jobs these days are in precarious work where people are not there for a long time, that certainly makes it more complex. The fact that deindustrialization also makes things much more complex. Like you don't have very large numbers of workers concentrated all in one place, all doing essentially the equivalent job. You have, a lot of decentralized work, working from home, working on the basis of supposedly independent or temporary contracts, all kinds of forms of fragmenting of the workforce that makes it that much harder. So we still have to make the case. I mean, we still have to fight for the attempts to unionize in the workplace. We still have to make the case that unions are in fact still important. Like, I know of people who will, I've had this conversation with people who say, oh, it used to be important, it used to be a good idea, but now the unions they've got everything that they needed. So now they're only a problem and not a benefit. So, we have to continue to make the case, and it's a difficult one, that's true. So Helen.
Well, I work in a unionized environment.
Mhm.
I see the problem as such. I don't think the union is effective enough. By saying that, I don't mean that we shouldn't unionize. It's still better to have a union than not to have a union.
Yeah.
That's for sure. But some of my coworkers do not see the union as useful as they are supposed to be. And this part of the reason is like it's an employer's market. It's employees are more vulnerable. But I also think the unions, they are not as aggressive and as strategic enough to advocate for workers' rights. I think if they can do more and make people see more benefits to be part of a union, that will help the union movement.
That's, yes. One of the things I'd point out, though, is like part of the problem, the reason for the weakness of the unions is the absence of the communists in the union movement. I mean, looking back over the whole history of the union movement in Canada, the communists played a really disproportionate role, as you would expect, in initially organizing unions and leading them. But we suffered some genuine setbacks. I mean, we were politically defeated in the period of the Cold War. The anti-communist offensive was actually successful in the sense that many unions voted out their communist leaders, or even expelled known communists. Were put red clauses into their constitutions that you couldn't be a member of the union if you were a communist. And there was a real offensive against the communists within the trade union movement. And in the long term, it had its effect, right? It's helped to promote the weakest, most reactionary elements of the union movement into leadership, the sort of the business unions, the ones who take the narrowest view of what the unions should do, that all they do is negotiate contracts for their own members, that they're quite passive in face of government attacks on workers' rights generally, that they don't see a political role for themselves, or at best, they see it as contracting out their role to the NDP. And they're not vigorous in their campaigns to organize the unorganized. They don't speak on behalf of the working class. They speak only for their own members. So that, you're right, like a weak union doesn't make a strong case for unionization to other people. So, but once again, that's just that's something we have to work on. So like somebody wrote here in the chat about how the unions have been, people don't see them as able to do any good. They've been declawed. And then someone else responded, so how do we give unions teeth if their claws are stolen? Yeah, so it's that what you're saying is yet another aspect of the difficulty of the situation. All right, we have to try to deal with all these issues at once. So I see people are putting things into the chat, which frankly I'm not able to follow along the chat and speaking as well. So maybe I'll ask some people if they want to just actually repeat what they said, put in the chat, and say it here in verbally in the discussion. So yeah, see MJ again. Yes, go ahead.
Hey, Naomi. I know some of the people in the chat have also spoken to me, I think in the last year or so. And I was saying that, you have to educate while also doing all these other things at the same time, because we're starting at a baseline of not even just zero, but there actually a lot of people are anti-communist in the sense of Cold War propaganda and other elements of our country's history has turned people against anything useful. So you kind of have to de-escalate that while also trying to activate them. And so there is no base. If you were to start a union with a bunch of people who are anti-communist, eventually it will burn down, right? So you have to kind of do everything at once while also starting somewhere. And I think that brings me to some conversations I've had with some people I recognize. One person asked me last year, he wants to start a union, but his workplace does not have one. Or he wants to, or other people want to start a union where their industry or sector of the economy might have a weak or failing union. What do we do when we're starting from absolute zero?
Right. Well, in fact, though, we aren't starting from absolute zero. There are unions, right? The fact that unions even exist and have an official, recognition in our country is the outcome of long, difficult struggle. And so it's not this, it isn't quite starting from zero, but it's starting from a situation which is even more complicated than zero, right? Because of the, of past history. But I'd also like to point out that there are ways of getting involved with people, of getting people actively involved in struggles without having to wait for them to come around to be socialists or even, particularly progressive. If an issue speaks to them, then, if you can talk to people about the issues that affect them and talk in terms of what can we do to work together to fight for a change in government policy or to put forward an alternate policy, that in itself is is beginning a process of that we would hope might result in people reevaluating their political assumptions. Like, for example, Corinne, I could probably talk more about this, like the campaign up to prevent coal mining in the parks was a rather successful in the sense that it did draw in different social groups, because there were different groups who would have been adversely affected by coal mining in the parks, besides the environmentalists who opposed it. From a general principle, there were specifically the parks and wilderness, the mountain climbing kind of people who wanted the parks preserved, but there were also the agricultural interests downstream who would be threatened by the contamination of water that they relied on. In southern Alberta, it's rather dry and they need that water. So people who would not normally be considered in the front ranks of resistance to the government could be all drawn together to support a campaign. In this case, the campaign to prevent coal mining in parks, because it was in their interest to do so. So we don't only talk to people about abstract ideas. I mean, I think actually the entrance point to a conversation is to find where they have an interest in common with the working class. So, I'll mention another example, like the municipalities, the mayors of small municipalities in Alberta have been speaking out about the problem of the energy sector corporations just not paying their taxes, right? Because those municipalities are really up against it for finances. So even, like the mayors of small towns in Alberta who are not a particularly Bolshevik group, they're in a position, they're forced into a position where they really are criticizing the government, and they're really, they're having to talk directly about what corporations are doing wrong. And so I think, there are going to be issues that really do seriously impact people. If we start with talking about the issue that really does affect them, and as much as possible relate that to a larger issues and to other issues, to bring more and more of those people, diverse people, together into one movement with one program, that would be success. So I see Corinne's hand is up. Corinne, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had to take my mute off. Yeah, I think we were very successful. You didn't mention the Indigenous people we involved.
Mm-hmm.
So there were 3 sectors that we were managing to pull together there. The tourist sector was one because of their interest in drawing people into the mountains. The cities also are dependent on that water, the ranchers, and also the Indigenous people. So there was another sector, and we were trying to do some similar work with regard to the tailings in northern Alberta, trying to draw different organizations working on environmental issues and Native people together. So we have a hell of a lot of issues that hit a very responsive note when you get out there. And we've got a lot of potential actually in trying to draw different peoples together. So it's there's no lack of issues.
But I do think that, ultimately what works is when the issues that people care about are also, really relate back to pocketbook issues, like when they can see that their direct short-term interests are threatened in the same way as their long-term collective interests. If those two things come together, that can be that can really be a spark for meaningful organization, meaningful activity. So people can be aware of their own short-term individual interests. Our job is to show them how that relates to their long-term collective interests. This is whether it's unionization or really any political activity or political movement as well. Anybody else? I don't see any hands up now. Mike, go ahead.
I guess I'll just chime in because I contributed in chat there, and I'll just say it again out loud. So my background is software engineering, and I've got some biases there, obviously. So about a month ago, I was working at actually Samsung, and I kind of got fed up with capitalism and quit my job, and I've been looking for a better way to spend my time. And it seems to me like a big issue right now is the extent to which capitalism controls the narrative. And with everything that's been going down with Twitter and Elon Musk, and what I feel is a really sort of bad take on freedom of speech. Freedom of speech right now is basically, if you have enough money, then you're free to say whatever you want to as many people as you want. But when freedom is ultimately like freedom of action, and in a capitalist system, your freedom is fundamentally limited by how much access to capital you have. And so I'm just trying to build a platform that's not motivated by profit, and that maybe gives people an avenue for organizing and communicating, and hopefully it evolves into a safe space for people to discuss their values and ways that they can pursue those values, and basically just be a communications platform to assist with organizing. And hopefully I'll have more to share about that as the weeks go on.
Yeah, right. Well, that's great. I mean, one of the areas in which, just in practical terms, we have not fully exploited the opportunities that there are for, online methods of communication, just basically any kind of modern forms of communication. We're not, we haven't been at the forefront of that. At the same time, it's, we have to always kind of keep in mind that real on the ground organizing is our ultimate goal. So I'd be, really happy to see if you have, can come up with tools that could be really helpful. So
that's definitely the plan, and I'll maybe try to bug you guys for some feedback once I'm a little bit further along.
Yeah, sounds like a plan. So, okay, so, but I think it's as we're saying before about the whole idea of nationalizing or creating workers' co-ops or whatever, it all depends on the context. Like any tool could possibly be used, by either the working class against the bourgeoisie, or by the bourgeoisie against the working class. And of course, right now, it really, you're right. It's really the bourgeoisie has the upper hand in maintaining control of the means of communication. And it's all the worse in that there's a superficial appearance as if it's totally open, like anybody can get on to those, and anybody can say anything, and there's freedom of expression and freedom of speech and so on. It gives more of an illusion that as if there really were a level playing field for the contention of the ideas of different classes, when, as we know, really that's not so. But that's one of the reasons, like it's part of our actual party platform that we had in the last provincial election, and I think will continue to be part of our platform for this election, is to have a public utility for this purpose, right? So that, a utility that really could be run as a nonprofit, that really could be a means of something that would provide equal access, right? Where
Absolutely.
So that would be the ultimate goal. It's not that we have to rely on individuals of goodwill doing their programming in their spare time, but an actual, part of the social infrastructure in the same way as hospitals and schools are, right? So, So Dre says maybe we should go back to paper missives. Well, actually, we do use paper. Like it is the Communist Party has a newspaper, People's Voice, and it's our policy is to continue to produce a paper printed version, right, of every issue. Because in part, that helps us to be able to distribute it in ways that we couldn't, to places where we might not be able to just gain people's attention. Those same people wouldn't necessarily go online to People's Voice if we're handing them a paper at a picket line or a demonstration or a meeting or some kind of gathering. So, and we want to retain the possibility of, we want to retain our own capacity to produce paper printouts in the event that we're actually, get excluded from various kinds of online forums. So. Okay, so I see some hands up, MJ again and Corinne again. So I guess in order. Oh, looks like MJ lowered his hand. So Corinne, go ahead.
I just had a wild sort of thing in my head. Someone is talking about organization. I had wondered if during an election we could somehow get a regular program going, like Zoom program, where people could, if they got the literature, we could have a print of the Zoom thing on the leaflet, and people could come in to join and discuss questions and things like that. It's something that's happening with Eve's Angler on Mondays at 4. And I notice I kind of get into it because I get a routine going a little bit. And I don't know if that might not be an idea just for the election to try out, to get some kind of discussion going, and then encouraging people that get the leaflet maybe to phone in or to zoom in, not phone in, but zoom in. Yeah, because he does seem to get sort of a regular following of people building up over time. I don't know, it's just an idea to throw out there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think it's a good idea. I mean, and not just, actually not just during the election. I mean, the election might be a good time to start it.
Yeah.
But
would be a good time. And then to see how it goes.
Yeah, but I mean, there are mechanisms, like there are people do like regular broadcasts, whether it's podcasts, which is essentially like online radio, or video, broadcasts, essentially kind of online TV. I mean, it is possible to do those things. And as they're saying, we haven't really fully exploited those. We haven't done those to the, to the greatest possible extent, even with a, relatively small organization with small resources. And that's something we need to cultivate in future. That's one of those ways of reaching people, and meeting people where they are. And in many cases, that's the way that we're going to meet people online. That's a reality. And hope to convert those online meetings to real in-person meetings and actual practical work together. But you're quite right. I mean, that's an area that we need to cultivate and develop more. So
It's something we have done a little bit of. For a little bit of time, we had some Zoom meetings around newspaper articles in the People's Voice. We haven't just done it too consistently. I mean, we are having educationals and things. So it would probably be just more a matter of trying to get it to be more of a consistent thing.
So, okay. Okay, anybody else? So, I see that there's a few people who haven't spoken up here, so I'd encourage you, anybody who hasn't spoken yet, got something to say? Okay. So, I see that something that MJ just put into the chat about so many things to learn from other elements, being left liberals or even Greens. So they are, and he points out, he works closely with them, so he's aware, they are political allies, not ideological allies. Yeah, I think that's that's a useful, important point for us to remember, is that we need political allies. I mean, politics is the business of creating alliances. If we insist that we refuse to ally with anyone who doesn't agree with us on all points or isn't ideologically aligned with us, we're going to have a very small group of allies. And so really, what we have to develop is we have to develop our capacity to create the broadest possible alliances, like find the greatest number of ways in which we could possibly find some basis of agreement, some way of working together with people, even quite distant from ourselves ideologically, because that working together is the mechanism that will start the process of actual discussions, of actually grappling with those differences, and hopefully that people would learn from experience that their ideology would come closer to ours. We feel confident that Marxism does really describe the world accurately, so that the more experience people have in political activity, the more they're going to come around to a Marxist point of view. I mean, we feel basically that reality will speak for itself, and so real life working together with people, would always work more to advantage than holding aloof from them. If we can find any forms of agreement at all. So, on even, as I said before, even the smallest, most modest, practical kind of opening to find some form of agreement and some form of practical work. Yeah, so MJ, go ahead.
Hey, Naomi, sorry, I keep putting up and down my hand because I don't want to hijack. So yeah, like there's so many things there. I won't go into the Greens and the left liberals like Eve Engler. He's so useful. He's so good as an activist. He's not very strong on ideology, but still useful. And there's still so much that we need to learn too. And for people, I think, on all different levels of the struggle, there's this brain drain of resources, means, knowing what to do and how to do it. And with so little resources, we kind of have to, we're kind of told to jump right into the fire and to kind of jump through hoops and punch in all directions. But, some of it is really just breaking it down into the smallest components of like, how do we make a poster? How do we target ideas in less risky ways? How do we get ideas across, and how do we differentiate, and just all these little tools? How do we use the internet in a more safe way, like communication? I think earlier there was a software engineer speaking. And of course, the internet is the biggest way that the left burns itself down all of the time due to threats from all different angles. So, we have to be open-minded, but I think that in the last year, I've really realized that the issues are so dire that the minute I stop doing anything, I just get so bored and I have to find a new way to do something. So even dropping like a dead drop, a poster that does nothing. A poster that literally does not connect to taking money, getting people who would probably end up being more problem than ally, but just convey a message like, this is stupid, or this other thing is great, even though they don't need to know who we are or what we're doing or what we want them to do eventually. We just want to plant seeds, or, using some of what the anarchists have kind of done, which is really just spray paint things in ways that are meaningful and get people to think in different ways. And I just think that there's so many tools that can build consciousness without directly putting people at risk, or even on resources of absolute zero for some of us who are trying to kind of stay in the game on other issues, but without any local organization or local education or local elements of safety. For example, policing won't keep us safe if we're communists, or in other elements of being disabled, people of color, LGBTQ people, lots of other elements where there's not much safety. With useful politics being, having a poster that says, oh, we're this organization or that, might draw people to come to that organization just to trash it, for example. So, there's lots of different ways. And I think a lot of the struggle is just, what tools do we use? It's like, where do we begin? And where is, how do we do that? How do we be useful? So yeah, I was just gonna end my brainstorm there. Sorry, just mastering the ground game is a matter of learning how to do things that others are doing, but then adapting them to the conditions. So, obviously a lot of other people can do a lot of these other things, like use the internet in ways that are much safer. I know the Green Party can swear and be really unprofessional and super fun and really funny, but I can't. I have to be behind an anonymous name and organizational front, because I can't be targeted in the ways that they would target Marxists. So I'll end it there. There's just so much to learn and so much to adapt to the conditions.
Okay, Jesse?
I think we also need to think about who we're targeting with this education and this propaganda and this advertising. Because right now the lumpen proletariat is very, very active in Alberta. And right now they're being manipulated, and they're being, in a lot of cases, paid off by reactionary elements. These are mostly rural individuals where I've, at least from my experience, maybe I'm wrong, but rural communities don't really get a whole lot of exposure to the Communist Party. So that might be something to look into as well.
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, you're right about that, right? It's our presence is primarily in the two biggest cities. We have only a scattering of members or friends in the smaller towns, and even less so in actual rural areas. But I think part of thinking strategically, though, is not just where the greatest numbers of people are, but who's most important to the economy. And I think it does come back to the working class and to the those who are basically two sectors. One is like the energy sector, the resource extraction sector, because that is the basis of the economy in Alberta. I mean, that's not what we want it to be. We would prefer to, to see it diversified. I mean, it's our policy that it should be diversified, and we should be developing secondary industry, to provide employment and to increase productivity, that we should not remain a resource extraction economy. But the reality is that's the case. And so the workers in that sector are are really important. The other being the public sector workers, because they're the ones who are at the front line of the attack. They're the ones directly under attack when funding is cut for healthcare or for education. Those are the workers whose jobs are most directly involved, or whose working conditions are most directly affected. But also they do have more of the large scale union organizing in Alberta, really, than any other sector. But nurses in general, the provincial government employees in general, right? Those are a couple of the biggest unions, because of the nature of the economy, in part because of the the successful anti-union campaign by the corporate sector, that there isn't the level of unionization in the energy sector and the supporting workers in the energy sector that we would certainly like to see. So those, like, we have a message for all members of the working class, and we actually have a message for all classes. Even some members of the bourgeoisie, like the smaller national bourgeoisie, there's maybe a role for them in an anti-monopoly coalition. But nonetheless, the strategically important workers are, I think we have to sort of focus in on who's really the most important with our limited resources. We're not going to turn away anybody who's interested in coming and talking to us. We're not going to repudiate opportunities to talk to others, but I think our planned campaigns need to be focused on some sectors of the working class, and the ones that are, I think, most susceptible to the message and most important, even if they're the ones not so susceptible, the ones who are strategically most important. So, well, I'd throw in a third category there, which is because of the long-term importance of organizing people who are now in precarious employment. That's another set of workers, very numerous, that we should be paying particular attention to. The service industry, because whether they in fact can successfully organize into unions will have a big impact on labor standards, wages, the strength of the working class movement, the relative balance of power between the classes in Alberta in general. It'll make a big difference whether those precarious workers are or are not successfully organized. So, yeah. Corinne?
Somebody said
Oh, it's Virginia, yes.
somebody said the lumpen proletariat was organizing. How is this happening exactly? I'm not quite sure I understand this. Whoever said that, maybe they can clarify that. Yeah, somebody said that.
Yeah, Jesse, go ahead.
Yeah, that was me. So we have the big example that we have is Freedom Convoy, which has been largely organized using the lumpen proletariat from what we know as capitalist sources, often from the United States. A lot of funding going into these very precariously employed or unemployed individuals who have nothing better to do but to go to Ottawa and voice their concerns that they've been led to voice, because it's much easier, frankly, to blame immigration or blame a government rather than blaming capitalist powers that are presently possibly paying you for the ills that you're experiencing. And this has happened lots throughout history. The lumpen proletariat has been always something of a source of ammunition for reactionary forces. And we're seeing that now in Canada.
Well, like, do those people make their living at a crime and somehow they're being paid to be in the Freedom Convoy or something like that?
Some of them are, yeah.
Oh, how do you know?
We have sources suggesting that they have been given money. Some of these major players have been given money from large corporate interests, including from the United States.
Oh, okay, and they make their living at a crime or something like that?
I'm sorry?
And they make their living at a crime?
Make what a crime?
They're living out of crime.
Oh, no, they're not living out of crime. The lumpen proletariat aren't necessarily criminals.
I thought
They do include the unemployed, the precariously employed, and those who tend to form themselves around that underclass.
Well, I think it's complex, right? Like, class is actually a complex thing, and there aren't necessarily really clear-cut dividing lines. Like, what divides the precariously employed worker from the precariously employed lumpen? Like, there's many factors. There's fuzzy boundaries. So, like, the most sort of iconic and clear-cut definition of, like where it's really clear that somebody's lumpen would be like they've never held a job, they engage in petty crime for a living, they're socially demoralized and alienated from working class members of their family and so on. That would be really obvious cases. But there's all, there's just lots of gray areas in between and sort of intermediate cases. I think we can say that even without making the distinction between the lumpen proletariat and the working class and other classes, that people who are insecure, like that their employment is threatened, even if they're not in what we refer to as precarious employment sectors. People who are insecure, their fears can be played upon by the right-wing propaganda and the populist sort of movements and so on that of essentially attempting to turn workers against each other with scapegoating and false explanations of where the problem comes from. So when people are scared, they're not thinking straight, essentially. So the precarity of their employment and the insecurity of the long-term job prospects is it's an important factor, and that's the reason it's really important for us to address the issues of what's some call just transition, like to focus on full employment and income security, to actually address the real fears and worries that people have, to bring them around to a more realistic and more class conscious point of view. So I see a couple of hands up here, John and then Scott. Yeah, Jonathan, go ahead. Sorry, we're not hearing you. Okay, so Jonathan, I see your microphone, but we don't hear you. So I'm going to actually go on to Scott. Maybe we can try Jonathan again later.
Hi, thanks, Naomi. I just want to double check, make sure you can hear me.
Yes, we do.
Awesome. So I just part of what you said, and I'm kind of new here. I'm learning, so forgive me a little bit. But lifelong Albertan, and I think especially kind of in after COVID, there is a lot of as you kind of mentioned, populist sentiment, a lot of kind of anti-government sentiment, especially with the Trudeau government in this province, and a lot within the working class that I'm seeing that I think that is something that I don't have necessarily the answers, but that's somewhere where the messaging I think really needs to focus on trying to harness that populist energy, but for a communist cause, because at the end of the day, I believe it is possible, but it hinges, I think as it continues coming up, it hinges on education and trying to be able to approach some people across Alberta where with these ideas without having them that demonization almost stopped it in its tracks, if that makes sense. So no, I really appreciate the conversation. So yeah, thanks for letting me speak here.
Okay, Jonathan, want to try again? See if we can hear you this time. Sorry, we're not getting anything from you there, so. Okay, anybody else? So, oh, I see he's oh, I see Jonathan's put something into the chat, says, my apologies, I was not sure why my microphone's not working. I was just going to point out that Street Church in Calgary is heavily active in turning the lumpen proletariat reactionary. Yeah. So, yeah, but there again, it's, you know, it all depends on context. Like, you know, even like religion, churches, they aren't necessarily always reactionary. It's also the case that some, you know, some denominations and some congregations are motivated by their religion to be active in the peace movement, and or to take part in, you know, civil rights and social justice movements. We know that the civil rights movement in the States, like, you know, the Black churches in the American South were like organizing centers for the civil rights movement, you know, for good or ill. I mean, for, you know, for all that they still have, you know, that some limitations because of their ideology, but nonetheless, it is certainly the case that there are churches that are definitely, you know, committed to really reactionary point of view these days, and they're the ones that get a lot more notice. So, you know, it's another a factor that of the ideological struggle. Yeah. So, yes. So, okay. Okay, I'm sorry that Jonathan's apparently not able to speak to us directly. Anybody else? Okay, so, okay, I'd like to, again, let you know sort of what we're planning over the next little while. Basically to have a discussion that's more directly focused on revising and developing our election platform. We know that the election's coming in May. So we're actually planning a provincial meeting on March 19th, in which we would, you know, have the sort of wrap up the discussions and vote on what will be our election platform for this coming election this spring. So we hope to have more discussions, and including if people want to make suggestions in writing for what would be what should be parts of our election platform. We started, you know, the first draft we started with is the one that was our platform in the last election, and I think it's held up quite well. You know, stood the test of time. But of course, new things have happened since then. You know, the situation, you know, the whole pandemic, the war in the Ukraine, the, you know, recent uptick in inflation and people's concerns about the cost of living. You know, these aren't reflected in there, and they, you know, I think they need to be addressed as well, like how those issues play out at the provincial level. We should, you know, have some points in there in our program for that as well, our platform. So this is discussion we'll be having over the next month and going into the election period. But also you know, we need to grapple with how we're going to publicize and promote our platform between now and the election. So this will also involve the practical work of making use of different online platforms and different mechanisms. I hope we'll actually be able to do some video work or some podcast work as well. And you know, that this could be the time to launch some things that might last longer than just an election campaign period. So at this point, okay, unless anybody else wants to say anything more, I think perhaps we can wrap it up.